Yes, I'm happy to start. In camera? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Amazing. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So my name is Augusta Senenssie. I am a policy consultant and ethnographic researcher, and I'm also the founder and head of research at Walinda Lingo. It's an ethnographic and multimedia consultancy firm, and we specialise on Indigenous displaced and rural realities across MAPAs and the Global South. Yes, ironically, I'm based between London and South Africa, so great setting, I think, for today's interview. Yeah, so definitely, Walinda Lingo is a play on the key Swahili expression Walinda Lingo, which means they guard or they keep the gates. And it's essentially an ethnographic and multimedia consultancy firm. We specialise in Indigenous displaced and rural realities across MAPAs, primarily in Africa and the rest of the Global South. And a lot of our theory of change is around disrupting the patterns and knowledge systems that we use in tackling global issues. And that doesn't just matter in policy settings, it also means in the private sector, amongst private interest groups, lobbying firms. This idea is to introduce other ways, other methods and learnings, and hopefully that increases better collaboration, community, and also change in a variety of different issues. I definitely think rural realities play a central role. I think you can't look at rural realities without considering climate change, the environment, and human rights. When we look at most Indigenous or rural communities, they tend to have a lot of issues with land rights, land issues, and land access. So historically, Afro-descent people, Latino people, Indigenous people, as landowners have been historically dispossessed, which means they don't have access to those lands anymore. These are family practices and traditions that have existed for centuries, for decades, millennia even, that have been stripped away from them through various different influences, whether that's colonization, imperialism, government policy that's prejudicial, or just through the fact that multinational corporations come into these communities, they take these lands away, or they pollute the areas that a lot of communities rely on. And I think if we have a strong international human rights framework, but also one that reflects the idiosyncratic nuances of different communities and parts of the world, then you actually guarantee more equality and more parity in experiences. So I think rural realities, Indigenous people, human rights are interconnected. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I know that this is kind of what's been touted this year. Like, I think the two key things you think about when you think about COP27 is that it's Africa's COP, but it's also the implementation COP, which I argue is actually more important than the Africa affiliation. And I think the central issue and challenge that Africa's faced is the fact that we're very siloed. So you have different regions of conflicting interests, you've got a lot of ethnic, cultural, and religious tension. That means that when it comes to negotiating as a bloc, a regional bloc, a community, there's a lot of challenges for Africa. What I'm really encouraged to see, especially with my conversations with party delegations at this COP, is seeing that there are central themes that bond Africa together that everyone is advocating for. When it comes to matters of a loss and damage facility, when we're looking at the fact that we need countries that have made pledges, financial commitments, technical assistance and capacity building commitments to fulfill these promises at COP. These are all really central things that I think a lot of countries and African countries and nations are corralling around. And I see that conversation and negotiations moving in the right direction. So maybe this could be Africa's COP, but we'll have to see how it goes. Right, so this is a really interesting question. I think when it comes to Indigenous voices, you can look at it from two levels. You can look at it from the official negotiations, so the backdoor meetings that many of us at this COP do not have access to, and then you can look at it from the blue zone or the green zone, places that we're in today. And I think one thing that I'm really encouraged to see a global commitment, a radical shift towards incorporating Indigenous voices and perspectives, not only through the vantage point of allies, but also by getting a lot of Indigenous representation into these meeting rooms to share their ideas, to discuss and to challenge the systems and states of oppression that have meant that for far too long, Indigenous voices and realities have not been included in these conversations. So I guess a really wordy, or maybe a bit more concise answer to that question, I think looking at the blue zone, I'm encouraged to see some Indigenous presence, and there's a lot more Indigenous presence in the green zone. I think the challenge and the question that we have for negotiators is how much of that knowledge, this insight and wisdom is actually being incorporated into the negotiations? How much of the Indigenous rights and provisions are being incorporated within those texts? And I think that will be the really interesting outcome of this COP, is seeing how much we prioritise Indigenous voices in the language that we see. Yeah. I think climate financing, you can't have an implementation COP without talking about money. It sounds really crass and really reductive. I know we're talking about kumbaya moments and building community, but you need to be able to finance those projects. And I think when we look about and we talk about and we reframe the narrative around climate financing, it can't be through the lens of just donor funds and aid. We aren't talking about mitigation financing. We're not talking about loss and damage in the way that allows the global north to accept culpability for our current climate crisis. But when you think about Africa's total contributions to this crisis, the numbers are flitting between 4 and 3%, but Africa is responsible between 4 to 3% of global carbon emissions, yet they are dealing with the most disproportionate and the worst effects of climate change. It's also historically the youngest continent in the planet, with about 46% of the population being under the age of 35. So it's really important. Yeah, I think climate financing is a quintessentially important part of Africa's climate strategy. And I think when we're talking about the fact that this COP is also unofficially dubbed the implementation COP, you can't talk about implementation without talking about the money. And I think when we're talking about money, it's important to talk about the benefits, but also to understand the people that we're dealing with here. Africa is one of the youngest continents in the world. It's also the one that's disproportionately affected by climate crises. We see so many figures cited by various UN agencies and institutions about climate migration, displacement. We've just had the worst drought season in 40 years in the Horn of Africa, displacing many women and girls disproportionately. We have severe flooding in parts of East and Southern Africa. And you also have droughts, the death of loads of livestock in the Sahel region of West Africa. So I think it's really important to see that the real-time effects and consequences of climate change are affecting Africa in real time, and therefore the financial remedies that we use to help Africa build resilience, to mitigate against these irreparable losses and damages, but also to adapt to the new climate reality are really important. So I think it's definitely, whilst it's really key to talk about 2050 and 2025 and 2030 being the ideal time to reach carbon net zero emissions and stop the worst of this climate crisis affecting communities, climate change is here now and it's affecting people, so we need to use those financial mechanisms and means to help those people that are most at risk and most feeling the consequences. So, short answer in a wordy submission, yes, I think that climate financing is really important. And I'm encouraged to see that being a really key part of the conversation, especially today with Finance Day. Well, this is an easy one. Short answer, no. Last year, several member states came together and committed $100 million, which, as we all know, in the grand scheme of climate change in terms of national GDP, is a drop in the ocean. And to date, we've only seen about 5% of that total pledge being committed and actively being paid towards developing member states. And I think that's one of the key challenges. I think when we talk about pledges, national determined contributions, there is so much fantastic language, really bold and grand ambitions and plans, but there's a really fundamental gap in the implementation of those promises and those strategies. And I think that's what we need to see this COP. Less of the fanciful language, less of these conversations around what ideologically in principle needs to be implemented, and more so getting that job done, making those financial commitments, offering that technical assistance, and making a positive change towards communities. Okay. Okay.
The second last one is partnerships. So how can we encourage, create those?
Yeah. I think green projects in Africa are a quintessential part of us meeting our climate reality. I think when we talk about Africa, it's fair to say that capacity-wise, it's a lot harder for African countries to reach those goals, to reach this idea and guarantee a just and fair energy transition. Guarantee that countries can make that change to mitigate and adapt to their climate reality without facing irreparable financial and economic growth or loss. And I think when we're thinking about that, a key partner in that discussion has to be the private sector. But the terms of engagement have to be fair. They have to be equitable. They cannot mean that African countries have to lose sovereignty, have to cede fundamental rights or privileges in order to get these fundings and investments. And we need to make sure that when we are offering loans from development banks and agencies, they don't come at the cost of undermining African sovereignty and freedoms. African countries need to still be self-determined and make decisions about their people that are in line with their beliefs and their societal structures. Because one thing we're seeing as a really big barrier to Africa developing at the same rate as the rest of the world is that we're trying to impose a Western idiosyncratic framework that does not exist in an African reality. And I think that's one thing that's really key when we're talking about private-public partnerships. They need to be fair, they need to be equitable. They need to also mean that Africa can retain its intellectual property, its data, and that people are benefiting from that there's a trickle-down effect. It's not just governments winning these huge bids and contracts, but the people are seeing active, real-time benefits in these private and public partnerships. And we also need to be working towards Article 6. Climate empowerment, climate education, empowering the people to understand why it's important to make these decisions, not just governments acting unilaterally. So I think generally speaking, as long as we open up the lines of communication, we get rid of the absence of transparency, which unfortunately plagues many African countries, contexts and cultures, I think we can see really great and exciting transformations that can make Africa more resilient, more adapt, and more ready to tackle this climate crisis. Okay. I think it's really clear that oil and gas will play a large role at this COP, especially when we look at the ongoing Ukrainian crisis, the sanctions on Russia, who supplies a large percentage of the world's oil and gas reserves, and the ensuing cost of living crisis that's affected most of the developing, but also the developed world. And I think if we're thinking about how Africa can use this knowledge, the attention on Africa's oil and gas reserves to their advantage, I think one key thing I've heard from several negotiators from several African countries is that they want to get protected status, vulnerable status for the entire continent of Africa, not just low economically developed countries, but also middle income countries too. And if we look back at COP26, one of the key opponents to the language in this seminal text of the negotiations, which was phasing down and out coal, was South Africa. But when we look at the news and who covered the language and who were the leading voices in opposition, it was India and China. And I think the argument that the South African delegation raised, which is very valid, is one of parity and fairness. South Africa still has a lot of issues when it comes to electricity. It has a lot of issues when it comes to shoring up and guaranteeing total energy security. And it's not fair to impose an expectation that South Africans or Africa as a continent should succeed and stop producing and benefiting from the oil and gas reserves that they have in bountiful supply, but be willing to sell that to the West when we have instances of conflict and uncertainty. There has to be a structure that is fair and equal.